Malacanang obliged, the lights went on, and then crash! A rock blasted out one of the lamps. One by one, the lights were put out by stones or sticks. Firefighters arrived at the scene literally to extinguish the political conflagration at the palace gates, but the hose they aimed at the protesters yielded, quote, a sputtering spurt. Then the comical became tragic as the protesters ran after and roughed up the fleeing firefighters, then rammed the fire truck into Malacanang's Mendiola Gate. The very center of power suddenly became a tear-gassed arena as the presidential guards at once engaged the protesters who were lobbing Molotov cocktails into the palace grounds. Now, amid the blaze of a parked vehicle that had been set on fire, the presidential guards managed to drive out the mob, and the battle shifted again to downtown Manila where, this time not just cops but, quote, constabulary troopers confronted the protesters, reports Lacaba. There were also looters among the defiant crowd who exploited the situation, smashing shop windows and spiriting away, quote, jewelry and shoes. Soon enough, quote, the soldiers started firing with Thompsons into the ground. And the dreadful staccato intended as a warning, and yet some protesters were hit by shrapnel. Lacaba himself became caught up in the frenzy of rushing some of the injured to the nearby hospitals, and it is remarkable, going by his account, that not a few residents in the area helped hide the protesters who, fleeing from their pursuers, had wandered into the maze of Manila's dark alleys. By dawn, the revolution of January 30th was quite over. Hundreds had been arrested, and an eerie, smoke-filled silence was restored in the city. But this was just the beginning of the storm. Marcos did not immediately issue his infamous dire warnings, his threats to suspend the writ of habeas corpus and declare martial law. He still maintained that air of equanimity, as opposed to the spitefulness attributed to him since. Nevertheless, this period became his transition to authoritarianism. Vice President Fernando Lopez resigned from the cabinet the next day. And recalling that eventful first quarter of 1970, Dan Mariano writes, although the country had more roads, bridges, dams, and irrigation systems than ever before, the economy had begun to nosedive. The peso underwent a 100% devaluation, with the exchange rate going from 2 to 1 to 4 to 1, then 8 to 1. The prices of basic commodities rose out of the reach of the working population, whose wages were not allowed to keep up with inflation. By April that year, a general strike was held protesting against increases in oil prices and transportation costs. The next year saw the Diliman Commune, the revolt by University of the Philippines students in February. But the signs of those times was not the Diliman Commune itself, which continues to throb gloriously in the memories of FQS veterans, but a parallel effort overlooked because it's inconvenient. As students barricaded the campus and broadcast a recording of the president's post-coital croonings to Dovey beams, some residents in the areas banded together and hunted down the radical students in the defense of order and their property rights. And it was Ferdinand Marcos, the last product of the American educational system, but a mutant one in that his political maturity took place during the confused, corrupt, and corrupting circumstances of the Japanese occupation, who gambled on form trumping substance. So as long as the trappings of legitimacy were maintained, the upper and middle class would embrace his revolution from the center and tolerate, if not actually accept with enthusiasm, his new society. The Plaza Miranda bombing took place on August 21, 1971. 2 days after that, 20 people were arrested as Marcos suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Martial law followed a year and a month later, restoring order on the surface, but fueling the already underground radical movement. Yet, when revolution finally came, it wasn't what the young radicals dreamed of in 1970. It was an entirely different creature, what came to be known as people power in 1986 and velvet revolutions elsewhere that succeeded. So when we return, we'll talk to a former activist from the heady days of the first quarter storm and see what it was like. Welcome back to The Explainer. Joining me is journalist Joanne Maglipol. Joanne, well, it's hard to imagine 40 years. So bring us back to that time and what was it like? What did it feel like?
There was a tenor of fear. But fear did not equate to cowardice. Fear was just a healthy respect for life. And at that time, life was threatened.
Now, what brought the students in your generation to dare to challenge the government all over the place and with such ferocity?
I think many factors. The biggest would be that the stimulus was provided for us, and that stimulus was that there was a dictatorship growing before our very eyes, and we had been educated in generally democratic institutions, very American-based, where there was supposed to be freedom of thought and questioning, and we took that very seriously. And there was also a sense of you had to do something about your beliefs or you were false. When you put all that together, we became a grassroots movement. Many of us were easily recruited because you had to be a little dumb, you had to be a little insipid, you had to be a little unaware or totally unaware for you not to be touched. So
and not to be angry about the big gap between the haves and the have-nots and the government.
Yes, the brazenness of power and money, the lifestyle, that was obvious. We had exposure to the media. In fact, one of the things that martial law killed was Think magazines, Asia Philippines Leader, the Free Press. All these magazines made students think. All over the country, people understood what was happening. It was explained to them in journalistic form. There was anecdote, proof, evidence, quote. Everything was done so that if you were to agree, then you knew that you were agreeing to something intelligent. And if you were to disagree, then you knew why you were disagreeing. You also had that intelligence. Given all that, the atmosphere of thought, free thought, somebody had to cause action to happen.
But even as your generation was trying to push the envelope and accomplish these changes, your elders were all freaking out about this. And that was Marcos's constituency, wasn't it? He was appealing to their fears.
Yes, my own parents were his constituency, essentially because they were afraid for us. They were afraid we would disappear. In fact, when soldiers came to the house with their arrest, search, and seizure orders signed by the now Senator Enrile, by the thousands, my parents, getting hold of this, and I wasn't there at that time, sent word to the province where I was vacationing at the time with friends and said, do not come home. So even our parents, who were going to toe the line, were going to follow the law, were not willing to have their children go under a rule that was very uncertain.